Imagine you're a military commander.
Okay.
You're sitting in this dark control room, and you're staring at a live drone feed.
Right, the classic scenario.
Exactly. And the target on your screen is this known terrorist operative, like the guy who orchestrated a massive bombing just yesterday.
So a high-value target.
Very high value.
Uh-huh.
And you have the shot. You have the total capability to just, end the threat right then and there.
But there's a catch, I'm guessing.
A huge catch. The guy on the screen isn't in a bunker. He's not out on some active battlefield. He's actually having dinner with his family.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, inside a crowded apartment building in the middle of a major metropolitan city.
Yeah.
So the question is, do you strike?
Man, I mean, for centuries, the law of war was incredibly brutal, but it was structurally pretty simple, right?
How so?
Well, armies literally lined up in fields. They fought other armies. You wore a blue coat, I wore a red coat, and, everyone knew exactly who was legally allowed to be killed.
Right, it was color-coded combat.
Exactly. But today, the battlefield isn't a field at all. It's the living room on that drone feed you just described.
Which is terrifying. And welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
Glad to be here.
If you are turning in right now, you are probably staring down the barrel of a massive international law exam. Or, maybe you're just insanely curious about the invisible rules that govern global violence.
Either way, you're in the right place.
You really are. Because today we are taking this incredibly dense stack of source material. I'm talking legal texts, historical treaties, international jurisprudence, all the heavy hitters.
It's a lot of reading.
It's so much reading. But our mission for this deep dive is to build you a definitive audio study guide. We're going to map out the whole labyrinth of counterterrorism law.
And we really want to extract the key legal tests, the rules of attribution, and those big historical evolutions.
Right. We want to show you exactly how states are actually held responsible.
So here is our roadmap for the journey. We're going to start by defining the absolute baseline legal rules of the battlefield.
Distinction and proportionality.
Exactly. Then we'll navigate the incredibly blurry lines of who is a civilian versus who is a combatant.
Which is way harder than it sounds.
Oh, it's a nightmare. After that, we'll examine how international law determines state responsibility, especially when it comes to, private military firms and proxy groups.
The shadow wars.
Right. And finally, we're going to unpack the super controversial legal evolution of preventative war.
I like to think of this whole international legal framework as like a centuries-old software operating system.
I love that analogy.
Right, because for hundreds of years, it was programmed to handle conflicts between two very distinct computers, two sovereign states.
It thrived on clear categories. State A attacks State B.
Exactly. But modern terrorism is this completely new decentralized virus. And today, we're going to see how that old operating system is just struggling so hard to patch its vulnerabilities.
Because it's trying to handle a threat it was never designed for.
Right, so before we can judge how a state responds to terrorism, we need to establish the rule book. We have to answer a question that sounds simple, but is actually a huge legal trap.
Which is?
When a state fights terrorism, is it fighting a war or is it fighting crime?
Oh, man. That distinction literally changes everything.
It does.
Yeah.
Because terrorism is such a hybrid phenomenon.
Yeah, our sources are really clear on this. It blends criminal elements, political goals, and military tactics all into one.
So a state can't just yell, "We're at war," and roll the tanks down the street.
Right. There are massive legal consequences to that. A real response requires police work, judges, intelligence, and sure, sometimes military action. But the state always has to operate within international law.
And when you look at those legal texts, you immediately slam into two foundational Latin concepts.
Yes.
The classics, "Requiescat ad bellum" and "Equius in bello." For everyone taking an exam, write these down. Let's break them down.
Okay, so equus ad bellum is the law regulating the actual right to go to war.
Like, are you legally allowed to start shooting?
Exactly. It governs the justifications. But ineus in bello, on the other hand, is what we call international humanitarian law, or IHL.
And that's what applies once the shooting has already started.
Right. It's the rules of the game during the war.
I always found ineus in bello to be the ultimate legal paradox. It basically says, hey, I know our two nations are currently trying to slaughter each other, but let's agree to do it politely.
That's a dark way to put it. Yeah. It dictates how war must be conducted, regardless of who started it.
Or even who is morally right.
Exactly. The law doesn't care who threw the first punch once you're in the ring. And to understand why these rules even exist, The sources trace the roots all the way back to 1625.
Wow, okay, going way back.
Yeah, to a guy named Hugo Grotius. He was writing during the 30 Years' War in Europe, which was just immense, unchecked slaughter.
So he was basically looking around going, guys, we need some ground rules.
Pretty much.
Okay.
He argued that even in war, the law is not silent. But the modern framework we use today, that really crystallized in the 19th century.
Because of the Industrial Revolution, right?
Exactly, because it didn't just change how we made textiles, it changed how efficiently humans could kill each other.
Yeah, you suddenly have explosive artillery shells, you have early machine guns, rifles that can hit a guy half a mile away,
The weapons technology was totally outpacing human morality.
which leads to these two parallel tracks of international law that our sources talk about. The first track was born at the Battle of Solferino in 1859.
Right, with Henry Dunant.
Yeah, he was just this Swiss businessman who happened to be there, and he sees like tens of thousands of wounded soldiers just left to die in the mud.
Because there were no medics, no infrastructure.
None at all. So he's horrified, he lobbies all these European leaders, and bam, you get the 1864 Geneva Convention.
Which created the Right of Geneva. And that is entirely focused on protecting victims. The wounded, the sick, and eventually POWs and civilians.
So that's the protection side. But what about the actual fighting?
That's the second track, the 1899 Hague Convention. And fun fact, the Tsar of Russia actually called this conference because the arms race was literally bankrupting European empires.
Wait, really? It was about money.
Oh, absolutely. They couldn't afford to keep inventing new ways to blow each other up, so the Right of Hague focused on limiting the methods and means of combat.
Like banning poison gas or expanding billets.
Right. It was a desperate attempt to agree that, okay, we're going to fight, but let's not use asphyxiating gas.
Okay, so if you are listening and studying for an exam, this is where your brain might start melting from all the history. Let's simplify it.
Good idea. Let's build that mental study guide.
Exactly. According to the texts, all of this history boils down to two fundamental pillars of IHL that you absolutely must know.
Number one, the principle of distinction.
Okay, what is it in plain English?
It is the absolute baseline. It's a states must at all times distinguish between combatants and civilians.
You can shoot a soldier, you cannot shoot a baker.
Exactly. You can target a military objective. You cannot target a civilian, period. And it also bans indiscriminate weapons.
What's an indiscriminate weapon?
A weapon that, by its very nature, can't be aimed precisely at a military target. Think biological weapons or unguided cluster bombs. If you can't guarantee who it will hit, it's illegal to use.
Okay, so that's distinction. The second pillar for the exam is the principle of proportionality. And this one is, well, it's a bit grim.
It's a very dark calculation. Proportionality basically acknowledges that, tragically, civilians are going to die in a war.
Right, collateral damage.
Yes. But it strictly prohibits causing incidental loss of civilian life that would be excessive in relation to the concrete direct military advantage anticipated.
Okay, let's use an example. Say there's an enemy sniper on the roof of a totally abandoned shoe factory.
Okay.
I can probably bomb the factory, right?
Yes, that's proportionate.
But what if that exact same sniper is on the roof of a fully functioning, packed civilian hospital?
You cannot bomb the hospital.
Because destroying a whole hospital just to get one sniper is disproportionate.
Exactly. The military advantage of killing one guy does not outweigh the massive civilian harm of leveling a hospital.
And this brings us right back to terrorism. Because the sources, specifically Protocol 2 of 1977, they explicitly prohibit acts of terrorism.
Right. The law defines terrorism in an armed conflict as violence aimed at spreading terror among the civilian population.
So by definition, terrorism is a violation of the principle of distinction. They are intentionally targeting the baker.
Exactly. Which creates a huge conceptual problem when governments start declaring a global war on terror.
Because words really matter here.
They do. Calling it a war shifts the entire paradigm.
Let's break that down for the study guide. What is the fundamental difference between criminal law enforcement and military operations?
Okay, so criminal law enforcement is designed to protect individual rights. It's about due process.
Right. Gathering evidence, assumed innocence, going to court.
And police operate on a shoot only in absolute self-defense paradigm.
But military operations.
Totally different. In a war zone, the paradigm is shoot on sight if the target is a legitimate enemy combatant.
So the danger, according to the texts, is that invoking this war logic allows a state to just bypass the courts.
Yes. It lets them relax legal guarantees and justify extreme measures globally,
Huh?
essentially claiming the whole world is a battlefield.
Okay, I had to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
Let's look at the reality on the ground. The rules of war say you can't attack civilians,
Right.
but terrorist organizations don't wear uniforms. They intentionally hide inside civilian populations.
They absolutely do.
They use apartment buildings as command centers. So if I'm a state military and I strictly follow the rules of distinction, aren't I putting myself at a massive, almost suicidal tactical disadvantage?
Yeah, and that is exactly the frustration military commanders voice every single day.
I mean, how do you fight an enemy that uses the law as a shield?
It's hard.
Oh.
But here's the crucial insight from the legal doctrine. International humanitarian law does not care about your tactical disadvantage.
Wow.
Really, its primary objective isn't to ensure a fair fight or a level playing field. Its singular objective is to limit cruelty.
That is a really harsh reality for a soldier on the ground.
It is, but the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, they are uncompromising on this.
Because if they budge, the whole system collapses.
Exactly. These rules weren't designed for polite disagreements. They exist precisely for when things get chaotic and violent and dirty.
Right. If a state just abandons the law the minute an enemy fights dirty, then the law ceases to exist.
A state cannot use its opponent's illegality as an excuse for its own illegality. The prohibition against targeting civilians is absolute.
Okay, so if distinction is the golden rule, the entire system completely relies on knowing who is a civilian and who is a combatant.
Which is the hardest part.
Right. Because modern terrorists aren't wearing red coats.
No.
So how does the law handle an enemy that weaponizes civilian identity?
This is where the legal architecture faces its ultimate stress test. We are trying to map a binary code. You're either a civilian or a soldier onto this incredibly messy, asymmetric reality.
Let's build comparison table for the exam prep.
Great idea.
Let's contrast legal combatant status with civilian participation. Let's start with the traditional side.
Okay, so in a standard international armed conflict, State A versus State B, a lawful combatant is a member of the armed forces.
So they wear a uniform.
Yes, a fixed distinctive emblem. They carry arms openly, and they follow the laws of war.
And what's their main legal benefit?
They have the legal right to participate in hostilities, and if they get captured, they are legally entitled to prisoner of war status.
Meaning they can't be thrown in regular prison for murder just because they shot an enemy soldier.
Right. As long as they didn't commit a war crime, fighting was their legal right.
Right.
You hold them as a POW just to keep them off the battlefield, and you release them when the war ends.
Okay, so that's the lawful combatant. On the other side of our table, we have civilians.
And the rule for civilians is simple. Absolute immunity from being targeted.
There's a condition.
An ironclad condition. They cannot participate in the fighting.
Which brings us to the most legally fraught category in our sources, the civilian who decides to pick up a gun.
Often called an unlawful combatant or an unprivileged belligerent.
What actually happens to their legal status the second they start fighting?
The moment a civilian participates directly in hostilities, they lose their civilian immunity.
So they can be targeted.
Yes. For the duration of their participation, the opposing military can use lethal force against them.
But, and tell me if this is right for the examine, they don't gain the rights of a lawful combatant.
Exactly. That is a critical distinction. Losing civilian immunity does not mean they suddenly get POW rights.
It's basically the worst of both worlds.
It really is. If they get captured, no POW status. They can be criminally prosecuted under domestic law for their acts of violence, murder, treason, terrorism, whatever.
But the word participating is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, because the sources draw a very sharp line between indirect and direct participation.
Yes, and this is where it gets highly technical.
Let's break it down. What's indirect?
Indirect participation is general support for a war effort,
Like what?
like supplying food to a rebel group, or expressing political sympathy online, or even working in a civilian factory that makes bullets.
Wait, if I work in a bullet factory, I'm still a civilian.
Yes. The factory itself might be a legitimate military target, so you might die if it gets bombed. But you individually do not lose your civilian protection against direct, deliberate attack just for doing your job.
Okay, but direct participation strips that protection entirely.
Right. Planning attacks, executing military operations, actively gathering tactical intelligence for a strike.
And the texts give a very specific three-part checklist for the exam to determine what counts as a hostile act.
The three criteria for direct participation. You need all three.
Number one.
The damage threshold. The act must be likely to adversely affect the military operations of a party or inflict death or destruction on protected persons.
Okay, so it has to actually cause real harm. Number two.
Direct causation. There must be a direct, immediate cause and effect relationship between the act and the harm.
And number three.
The nexus. The act must be specifically designed to inflict harm in support of one party to the conflict and to the detriment of another.
Okay, let's test this. I want to throw some incredibly difficult real-world exam scenarios at you using this three-part test.
Bring it on.
Scenario one, human shields.
Oh, this is a moral and legal nightmare.
Right. So how does the law handle it?
Well, the law distinguishes between voluntary and involuntary human shields.
Okay, let's say it's voluntary. A civilian intentionally travels to a military compound and stands in front of the gate to stop a drone strike.
In that case, many legal scholars argue this meets the nexus and damage threshold. They are actively attempting to alter the military reality.
So they lose their protection. They are participating directly.
Yes, potentially.
But what if it's involuntary? What if a terror group takes over my apartment building, locks the doors, and forces me and my family to stay on the top floor while they shoot rockets from the roof?
Involuntary human shields remain protected civilians. Full stop.
Even though the terror group is using them?
Yes. The terror group is committing a war crime by using them, but the attacking force must still apply the rule of proportionality.
So the military commander still has to factor those locked-up civilians into the calculation before authorizing a strike.
Exactly. The illegality of the defender does not absolve the attacker of their own legal obligations.
Okay, scenario two. Religious or political leaders.
Okay.
Let's say there's a cleric. He's at a poet, exalting combat, using religious arguments to convince people to join a terror group. Can a drone strike target him?
Under international law, generally no. Mere ideological support or propagandizing is not enough to constitute direct participation.
Really? Even if he's radicalizing people?
Right, because words alone don't meet the direct causation threshold. To lose civilian protection, that leader must be implicated in actual operational decision-making.
Like, is he picking the targets? Is he funding the specific bomb materials?
Exactly. Unless he is directly inciting an imminent act of violence, he remains a civilian. Now, the state can absolutely arrest him and try him for criminal incitement, but they can't drop a bomb on his house.
Okay, let me give you the hardest scenario. The sources literally call this the revolving door problem.
Ah, yes. The classic dilemma.
Imagine a civilian joins a terror group. He carries out a shooting attack on a military checkpoint.
Okay.
Then he drives home, hides his rifle under the floorboards, eats dinner with his kids, and goes to sleep.
Right.
2 days later, he plans to do it again. Is he a civilian while he is sleeping in his bed?
This is one of the most fiercely debated issues in all of counterterrorism law.
Because if you take a strict view of the law, he only loses protection for the exact duration of the attack, right?
So the moment he puts the gun down, he's immune again.
But that's absurd. It's like a game of tag. You run off base, shoot at a soldier, and then sprint back to home base and claim you're a civilian so they can't shoot back.
It completely paralyzes military operations.
So how does the doctrine solve this?
The texts address this through the concept of continuous combat function.
Continuous combat function.
Right. If a person assumes a continuous function within an organized armed group, meaning they are carrying out a chain of hostile actions, they lose their civilian immunity entirely.
So they don't regain it just by going home for the night.
Exactly. The legal logic is that the rest period is essentially just logistical preparation for the next hostile act. They are a legitimate target even while sleeping.
Wow. Okay, so we've established how legally perilous it is to target terrorists on a battlefield.
It's a minefield.
But what happens when a state actually captures a suspected terrorist?
Right.
Or, what happens to the massive civilian populations trapped in territories controlled by these groups?
Right, moving from the battlefield to the courtroom.
And to the realm of humanitarian aid. Because this brings us to the state's ultimate dilemma: balancing absolute security imperatives against international human rights obligations.
The foundational rule here, and this is something that is often very difficult for the public to accept right after a horrific terror attack,
Yeah.
is that there are no black holes in international law,
Right.
meaning Even the most dangerous suspected terrorists are protected persons under human rights law and the Geneva Conventions.
So you can't just throw them in an undisclosed black site and throw away the key.
Absolutely not. They have an inalienable right to humane treatment. No torture, no cruel or degrading treatment, regardless of whatever intelligence they might possess.
And they have the right to a fair trial.
Yes. And the sources outline a very specific checklist from the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights.
Let's do another checklist for the exam prep. What are the non-negotiable elements for a fair trial in counterterrorism?
Okay, first, there must be access to courts for all persons. Doesn't matter their nationality, doesn't matter if they are stateless.
Number 2.
Independence. The judges must be entirely independent and impartial, completely free from political pressure.
Right, no show trials. Number 3.
States must avoid using special or exceptional tribunals.
Why is that?
Because historically, those ad hoc courts are designed specifically to bypass standard evidentiary rules just to secure a conviction.
Got it. Number 4.
Military courts should be strictly restricted to trying military personnel for military offenses. You shouldn't use a military tribunal to try a civilian accused of terrorism.
And the final point on the checklist.
The defense must have access to the prosecution's materials. The accused has the right to see the evidence against them so they can mount a defense.
Wait, hang on, I have to stop you there.
What's up?
Because the real-world application of that last point is wild to me.
It's definitely complicated.
Right, like if a state captures a high-level terrorist, the evidence they have against him is probably highly classified intelligence. So,
Almost certainly. Signals intelligence, satellite tech.
yeah, it might compromise undercover agents. So if the state is forced to give this guy a totally transparent public trial and hand over the classified evidence to his defense attorney, aren't they basically handing their entire intelligence playbook over to the enemy?
It is a massive security risk. And intelligence agencies argue this constantly. They say the standard criminal justice system is fundamentally incompatible with protecting national security secrets.
So how does the law justify it?
Well, the legal philosophy in our text presents a really stark counterargument. They argue that this risk is simply the price of a state's legitimacy.
Explain that. Why does legitimacy outweigh immediate security?
Because terrorism, at its core, is a strategy designed to provoke a state into overreacting.
They want the state to lash out.
Exactly. They want the state to abandon its own values. And legal scholars note that disproportionate repression, like spending fair trials, using torture, holding people indefinitely, it ultimately engenders more terrorism.
It radicalizes people.
Yes. It radicalizes marginalized populations and hands the terrorist group a massive propaganda victory. They can say, look, this government is just as brutal as we said they were.
So if the state abandons the law to fight the monsters, it becomes indistinguishable from the monsters.
The law is literally the boundary line between legitimate state action and just mere violence.
Wow. So if a state compromises its legal principles just to get a conviction, they might win a tactical victory, but they lose the ideological war.
Precisely.
But this tension between security and human rights, it doesn't just affect judges and spies. It severely impacts humanitarian aid workers on the ground.
Oh, massively. There is an ongoing clash between state counterterrorism legislation and international aid agencies.
Right. The ICRC has been ringing the alarm on this for years.
Because after 9/11, the UN Security Council mandated that all states criminalize any financial or material support to designated terrorist organizations.
Which on a macro level makes sense. You have to freeze terror financing.
Absolutely. But on a micro level, the legislation is often written so broadly that it accidentally criminalizes humanitarian action.
Let's use the specific example from the texts. USAID, the United States Agency for International Development.
Perfect example. So USI requires non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that receive their funding to sign an anti-terror certificate.
Okay, what does that mean?
By signing it, the NGO legally guarantees a strict no-contact policy with designated groups like Hamas or the Taliban. They have to ensure absolutely no material, food, medicine, or funds end up in those groups' hands.
I mean, to a taxpayer, that sounds logical. Why would we want tax dollars subsidizing a terror group?
In a boardroom in Washington, it makes perfect sense. But it shatters when you get on the ground.
Why?
Because often these designated armed groups are the de facto governing authorities in regions experiencing massive humanitarian crises.
Oh, so if an NGO wants to deliver, say, cholera medicine to a starving village in a territory controlled by the Taliban,
They inherently have to interact with the Taliban.
they have to pass through their checkpoints.
Exactly. They might have to pay a toll or a tax just to cross a bridge. They have to coordinate logistics with the local warlords so their convoys don't get ambushed.
But under these strict anti-terror laws, paying that toll to cross the bridge could technically be construed as providing material support to terrorism.
Exactly. So the 25-year-old NGO worker suddenly faces the risk of criminal prosecution back home, or the NGO risks losing all of its international funding.
So the anti-terror certificate just paralyzes the aid workers.
Yeah.
The legal risk is just way too high.
It creates a massive chilling effect. Vital aid is delayed, it's rerouted, or it's completely blocked because NGOs are terrified of accidentally violating sweeping terror laws.
Which is why the ICRC is pushing so hard for humanitarian exemptions.
Right. They are aggressively advocating for laws to explicitly state that impartial humanitarian organizations are allowed to fulfill their mandate without being treated like criminals for navigating a war zone.
Okay, let's pivot. We've established that prosecuting an individual, whether it's a terrorist or an unlucky NGO worker, is relatively straightforward for a state.
True.
But what happens when the state itself is the one acting in the shadows?
Oh, this is the really muddy water.
Right. What if a sovereign government is secretly funding a rebel militia? Or what if they hire a private corporation to conduct interrogations? How does an international prosecutor connect those dots back to the government?
That brings us to the absolute legal nightmare of attribution and state responsibility.
Let's get into the attribution rules for the exam. Explain it in simple language.
Okay. In international law, you cannot simply punish a state just because bad things happen on its territory.
Right.
To determine state responsibility, international courts need to find two specific elements of an internationally illicit act.
Element 1
The behavior must be legally attributable to the state.
and element 2.
That behavior must violate an international legal obligation.
So attributable is the magic word. If you don't have attribution, you have no state responsibility, no matter how horrific the crime is.
Exactly. The core question for any international tribunal is always, can we legally prove the state ordered this?
And to answer that, the law relies on 3 distinct categories of detective work. Let's do another checklist.
Good call.
Category 1, organs of the state.
This is the easiest avenue. Any act committed by a formal organ of the state, the military, the police, intelligence agencies, the legislature, is automatically attributed to the state.
Even if the guy goes rogue.
Yes. Crucially, it doesn't matter if the individual agent exceeded their authority. If a uniformed police officer commits an extrajudicial execution while on duty, the state is internationally responsible.
The sources give a very stark counterterrorism example for this. The CIA's Extraordinary Renditions Program after 9/11.
Yes, extraordinary rendition was a global program of illegal extrajudicial transfer of suspected terrorists.
Basically kidnapping them and moving them from one country to another.
Right. Usually moving them outside the jurisdiction of U.S. courts, sending them to third-party countries known for torture, or holding them in secret black sites.
And the logistics were crazy. They used shell companies to lease airplanes, filed false flight plans, operated entirely in the shadows.
But legally, the attribution is crystal clear.
Because the CIA is a state organ.
Exactly. Because the CIA is a formal organ of the U.S. government, every single action in that program, the kidnapping, the secret detention, is directly attributable to the state.
The legal fiction of using a shell company doesn't sever the link.
Not at all.
Okay, so state organs are easy, but what happens when a state intentionally tries to sever that link?
Yeah.
Category 2. Private actors or firms.
This is where the corporate veil becomes almost impossible to pierce.
Right. Because acts by private individuals, proxy militias, or private security companies are only attributed to the state if they act as de facto agents.
Meaning they must be acting under the direct instruction, direction, or control of the state.
And what constitutes control is a massive legal tug-of-war. The texts highlight 2 competing standards, the effective control test and the overall control test.
This is vital for the exam. Let's look at the origin of the effective control test.
Right, the Nicaragua case in the 1980s at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ.
Exactly. So the U.S. was funding, training, and equipping the Contra rebels who were fighting the Nicaraguan government. And the Contras committed massive human rights violations.
So the legal question was, is the U.S. responsible for those specific abuses?
And the ICJ ruled.
No. Wait, really? Even though they funded them?
Yes. The ICJ said financing and equipping alone isn't enough. To hold the U.S. responsible, the court demanded proof of effective control.
Meaning what exactly?
meaning evidence that the U.S. government had directed or enforced the specific operations where the abuses occurred. Did a CIA agent specifically order the burning of that exact village? If not, no state responsibility.
That sets the bar impossibly high. How does a prosecutor ever prove a secret order for a specific crime?
It's incredibly hard. Many scholars argue it's too high, which led to the second standard, proposed by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, in the Tadic case.
The overall control test.
Right. The ICTY argued that if a state equips, finances, and fundamentally organizes a proxy group, the state should be responsible for the group's actions overall, even without proving they ordered the specific crimes.
So overall control is the macro relationship, while effective control demands a micro-level paper trail.
Exactly.
How does this apply to modern private military companies? The sources bring up Abu Ghraib.
Right. The prison in Iraq in 2004, we saw severe abuses of detainees. And while U.S. military personnel were involved, the military also relied heavily on private security contractors from corporations like CSCI and Titan.
They're conducting interrogations. But because they are corporate employees, the military chain of command doesn't apply to them in the same way.
Precisely. Establishing direct state responsibility for the specific actions of private contractors under that strict effective control test is a labyrinth.
The state can just say, hey, we hired them for a legal job. They broke the law on their own time.
Yes. So ultimately, courts find it much easier to just prosecute the individual 25-year-old contractor for his specific crimes rather than proving the sovereign state itself is internationally liable for the corporation's behavior.
The texts also point to the Janjaweed militias in Darfur.
Right. The Sudanese government used these armed proxy militias for a brutal counterinsurgency. Everyone knew the state was coordinating them.
But proving in court that the state had effective control over every single village raid is virtually impossible.
States deliberately use these proxy groups specifically to exploit this legal loophole. It gives them plausible deniability.
Okay, category 3, assumed acts. What happens when a state is actually proud of the proxy group's actions?
This applies when a state unequivocally acknowledges and adopts a terrorist act as its own.
Like the Taliban, Al-Qaeda before 9/11.
Exactly. Al-Qaeda was a non-state actor in Afghanistan, enjoying the protection and ideological sympathy of the Taliban regime.
But legally, did the Taliban adopt 9/11?
Legal doctrine tends to interpret that they did not formally adopt the attacks as an official act of the Afghan state. Mere sympathy, or even providing a safe haven, is generally not enough for legal attribution under the specific category. The state has to formally endorse it as state policy.
Okay, if we step back and look at these control tests, their limitations are glaring.
They really are. They were designed for 20th century conflicts with formal chains of command.
But today, states use indirect control, private firms, shadow proxies. If a state is attacked by terrorists, and tracing it back to a sponsor state is legally impossible.
States get incredibly frustrated.
And that frustration leads to the ultimate legal escalation.
The use of military force.
If the legal system won't let a state punish the sponsor, can the state just use its military to eliminate the threat before the next attack happens?
This touches the absolute core of the global order. And to understand it, we have to start with the bedrock rule, Article 2.4 of the UN Charter.
Written right in the ashes of World War II.
Yes, it was a revolutionary attempt to literally outlaw war. It categorically prohibits the use of force or even the threat of force against the territorial integrity of another state.
But they couldn't outlaw self-defense, so there are exceptions.
2 exceptions. First, authorization by the UN Security Council. Second, Article 51, the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense.
Let's drill down into Article 51 for the exam. What are the strict legal criteria to claim self-defense?
Self-defense must be in response to an armed attack, and the response must meet 3 criteria: necessary, proportional, and immediate.
Then came September 11, 2001, a massive paradigm shift.
Huge. The UN Security Council passed Resolution 1368. It recognized the right to self-defense in the context of the attacks, and scholars debate this endlessly, it didn't explicitly authorize military measures.
Which sparked the huge debate. Is a terrorist attack by a non-state actor actually an armed attack under Article 51?
Traditionally, an armed attack meant State A attacking State B. If a group of individuals commits violence, does that give you the right to invade a sovereign country to stop them?
The legal world is divided.
Deeply. Some say terrorism creates a new customary rule allowing self-defense against non-state actors. Others say that interpretation destroys the prohibition on the use of force entirely.
If we look at the strategic doctrines across U.S. administrations, and to be clear, we are just impartially reporting the sources here, not taking sides,
Right, just looking at the legal arguments.
we see a fascinating evolution of preventive war. Let's start with the Bush Doctrine in 2002.
The core argument there was that the traditional concept of an imminent threat had to change. Traditionally, imminent meant an army massing visibly on your border.
But terrorists don't mass armies, they hide. They seek weapons of mass destruction.
So the Bush strategy explicitly stated the U.S. must act against emerging threats before they are fully formed.
Which legally blurs imminence. If you strike a threat before it fully forms, you move from preemptive self-defense to preventive war.
Right. Then the sources shift to the European Union strategy around 2005.
How did they handle prevention?
The EU focused heavily on ideological roots. Instead of military preemption, they emphasized preventing radicalization through societal and educational programs.
Okay, then we get the Obama Doctrine in 2015.
This attempted to rein in the expansive rhetoric. It rejected a war against Islam, focused on law enforcement outside active hostilities, but it still reserved the right to take decisive military action.
Though it tried to anchor it back to an imminent threat.
Yes. And finally, the Trump Doctrine in 2017 swung the pendulum back toward anticipation, focusing on acting against safe havens and digital networks before they threaten the homeland.
Looking at this whole timeline, if we keep adapting the rules to let states attack threats before they form, haven't we essentially deleted Article 2.4? Doesn't this give powerful states a blank check?
That is the existential concern among international lawyers. Expanding self-defense to preventative war creates a permanent state of exception.
Because if a threat is hidden, you can always claim it's imminent.
Exactly. Preventative war lets a state subjectively decide what is legal, turning international law into a tool of state power rather than an objective rulebook.
Man, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. If your exam is tomorrow, let's do a rapid-fire recap.
Let's do it.
First, IHL principles, distinction and proportionality. Separate combatants from civilians, and military advantage must outweigh civilian harm.
Second, participation. Civilians lose immunity only if they meet the strict criteria of damage, causation, and direct access.
Third, attribution. States are responsible for organs, but holding them responsible for private firms requires proving strict control.
And fourth, the shift toward preventive war challenges the foundation of the UN Charter.
If you grasp those tensions, you understand asymmetric conflict law. But before we go, here's a final thought to mull over.
The future.
Right. We've talked about how 20th century laws struggle with 21st century terrorism. But what happens tomorrow? Conflicts are moving into cyberspace.
The virus is going digital.
Imagine a state-sponsored hacker group releases malware that cripples a power grid. It shuts down hospitals, freezes water plants, causes deaths, without a single bullet being fired.
How does an armed attack apply to an algorithm? How do you calculate proportionality for a cascading cyberstrike?
How do you define direct civilian participation when a teenager with a laptop shuts down a stock exchange from their bedroom?
The law is a living organism, and its next mutation is already underway.
It makes you wonder if we can just patch the old operating system or if we need entirely new code. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning those unseen legal structures, and we will catch you next time.